Hey everybody, welcome to the third video for week one. I'm going to talk about the political media in the 21st century in this lecture. And to start, I want to back up to the end of the 20th century because the changes that have transformed the media landscape into the one that we currently live in began in the late 20th century, and they began with technological changes that eroded the dominance of the public service-oriented media. So what I've called the sort of so-called golden age, so-called because it was a golden age in a way because the American political media was public service oriented. The media institutions were self-consciously and intentionally and also by law playing the three roles that democratic theory demands of the media. And they were playing it with a set of values and professional best practices that aligned with the needs for objectivity, openness and inclusiveness and assertiveness. Why did that golden age end, right? And one of the things is, one of the great things about the changes that happened is one of the shortcomings, probably the biggest shortcoming of the so-called golden age was the limited perspective. It was largely a white male, college-educated perspective, a mainstream establishment perspective. And the reason why that was the dominant perspective was because the media technology was such that to have a mass audience, or to have an audience at all really, what required control over some large-scale communication, transportation, and information gathering. You needed to have a nationwide network of television stations or radio stations or a large metropolitan or national newspaper or magazine in order to be able to essentially have input into people's perceptions of politics, the debate, the information, the sort of check and balance was all being conducted by these large mainstream media companies. Now, that's not to say that there weren't non-mainstream media. There were all kinds of alternative newspapers and magazines. There were zines, there were pirate radio shows, there were cable access television shows. There were, on the margins of the mainstream media, there were alternative forms of media, but they reached very few people. They did not have any kind of significant impact on the overall political discourse or political activities. And so while they existed, and I want to acknowledge they existed, they were largely ignorable. What happened in the late 20th century was that technological advances, which started with satellites and cable television, and then became the internet, and then smartphones, streaming, media, is opportunities for those people who were excluded from the mainstream mass media arose to have their voices heard, to be able to enter into the media landscape in a way that was actually impactful. And so what happened was there were technological changes that more or less broke the monopoly that these large mainstream media institutions, ABC, CBS, NBC News, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, USA Today, major radio networks, their dominance over the media landscape was broken by the spread of technology. And I won't go into all of the specific technological advances that led to this, that produced the current environment, because you're probably pretty familiar since you have access to and probably make use of many different forms of media. When I was a kid, there was television, news, 3 stations, and it was on at the same time. From 5 o'clock to 7 o'clock was news, 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock was local news, 6 to 7 was national news. It was repeated again at 10 and 11 o'clock. And there were no other TV stations. So if you were going to watch television at 6 o'clock, you were watching the national news. What that allowed in terms of the public service orientation was to these mainstream media companies, they could make sure that they were doing their job to the utmost of the sort of professional values and best practices, because they didn't really have to compete with anything else. They didn't have to compete with alternative media because they were at the margins. They didn't have to compete with other forms of non-political media like entertainment because they had those time slots. As soon as there was cable television, as soon as at 6 o'clock you could actually watch MTV instead of your choice between three college-educated old white men reading the national news, Walter Cronkite, and I forget who the other guys were, Tom Brokaw and Peter Jennings. You could, at 6 o'clock, you could choose between those three guys. Now you could watch MTV instead, or you could watch Comedy Central, or you could watch HBO. As soon as that happened, the mainstream news outlets now had competition for viewers' eyes. And what that meant was that they could be turned away from. And so they had to do what they hadn't had to do throughout most of the 20th century, which was attract viewers. And so right there was a change in the environment that opened the door to greater sensationalism. There was a greater imperative to draw an audience. At the same time, because of sort of changes in the global economy, these large companies that owned these media outlets were exerting more and more pressure on the news divisions to actually make a profit, and they were no longer going to be subsidized. So there were two forces that pushed the mainstream media in the direction of having to actually, instead of just blandly and perhaps boringly and from a narrow perspective, broadcast what they thought the American people needed to know about the political situation and then current events and world events. Now there is competition. There were other changes, political changes, the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine, that opened up the possibility for having radio stations that were purely dedicated to one political perspective or another. There were also cable radio stations that came about. There was a proliferation of outlets. With the coming of the internet, there were now web pages, and then later on there was streaming media and podcasts, and then in the early 20th century, social media outlets like Facebook, and then Twitter and Instagram and YouTube. All of these things increased the competitive landscape. So one of the biggest transformations in the American political media landscape in the late 20th century, and then it sort of was completed by the first decade of the 21st century, was that there was massive and ferocious competition for the political media from the non-political media. And that meant that the golden age had to end, because part of the golden age the ability of media outlets during the golden age to fulfill that public service mission with those values of objectivity, openness, inclusion, and assertiveness was that they were doing so in a non-competitive environment. And now there's a competitive environment. And the competition is from other forms of media, entertainment, right? You could watch HBO, could watch The Sopranos instead of watching the news. And that's actually, I turned away from the news an awful lot to watch things like The Sopranos. And that's not even in the late 90s, there was nothing like the kind of availability of shows. You still had to wait for it to come out. You couldn't just stream it. The competition from the non-political media only increased as communication technology improved over the course of the first 2 decades of the 21st century. There was also a fragmentation of sources available. It was no longer just, okay, listen to the radio, watch television, or read a newspaper or a magazine. Now you have multiple options for getting information and or turning to media for entertainment, right? There's now web pages, there's streaming video, there are social media sites, there's podcasts, there's on-demand television, there's all of the stuff that you know is out there, that in fact, right at this very moment that you're watching this video of me, one, I'm using a social media channel. It's coming to you through YouTube. The modern communication technology is allowing me to do this form of remote teaching. But also, as you're watching this, there are all kinds of other things that are demanding your attention. And so to a certain extent, I have to compete with that. And while I'm not part of the political media, I am part of the educational establishment, and the educational establishment has to compete with these other forms of media, these other forms of entertainment. What this fierce competition has created, and what this increased access has done to the media landscape, is fragmented it tremendously, and it has created opportunities for each of the 4 previous stages to reappear in different forms, though with some very similar features. I'll sort of move backwards through the forms, even though the notes are laid out left to right, moving forward through time from the partisan press to the party press to the profit-oriented press to the public service press. I want to start with what the public service press has had happen to it. We still have the mainstream media. We still have the New York Times and ABC News, and now we have more of it. We now have CNN, and there are, you can actually get the Washington Post online. So the mainstream media still exists. There's some addition to it through cable stations, and there's greater access to it. Like just before I did this lecture, I was reading the Washington Post on my phone, in my car. I wasn't driving. I pulled up to a parking spot, and I just checked my email, and I saw that I had an alert from the Washington Post, a news email blast that said, here are the articles, and I started reading them. That was, so I was getting the public service press, the mainstream media, through one of these new technologies, which is very common. So one of the things that has happened to the mainstream media is it has become more accessible, right? I didn't have to actually have the Washington Post with me in order to be able to read the Washington Post. The mainstream media is still self-consciously and intentionally playing that three-part public service role. They are doing so, though, with that increased difficulty that now this stuff, which can be kind of boring, right? Playing those three roles can be kind of boring. They have to do so in a competitive environment, and so to a certain extent, there is a sensationalism, and to a certain extent, there's this scrambling to grab our attention, which is one of the reasons why I had an email from the Washington Post, which I have subscribed to. They wanted to remind me, hey, the Washington Post is here, and they knew they had to get into my inbox to do that because I might not otherwise just pick up my phone and go to the Washington Post app, or certainly pick up the Washington Post, the actual paper, which I don't actually get the real paper. The other thing that has happened to the public service press, the mainstream media, is that the main problem of the narrowness of perspective has been softened up a little bit, right? It's no longer just older, college-educated white men who have been part of the political and media establishment forever and who are upper middle class, people with a certain sort of narrow range of values. It's no longer limited to those people. There are way more women, there are more people of color, there are people with various kinds of backgrounds. Almost everybody is still college educated, and many of those people are still part of the sort of political and economic establishment. They're mainstream people. They do still have mainstream moderate values, no matter whether they're conservative or liberal or in the middle. They really do have these kind of moderate values, and they also do all have the values of the profession of journalism. Objectivity, openness, inclusion, and assertiveness. And so there is still that cultural commonality. So the narrowness of the perspective of the mainstream media has been softened up. It's been broadened, but it still hasn't really been broadened completely. However, other perspectives and voices have their ability to get an audience and to jump into this competition because of the other outlets that are available. Now, I'm going to move backwards through the profit-oriented press is back and really within the mainstream media. This is one of the things that started happening in the 80s with the advent of cable television, is that the mainstream media outlets themselves started to sensationalize because they wanted to drive better ratings. They were now competing in the 6 o'clock and the 5 o'clock time slot with all these other forms of entertainment that were available to people. And so, for example, now CNN, which is a mainstream company that was born because of cable, but it kind of adopted that same ABC, NBC, CBS News approach, CNN alternates between what I think of as kind of public service-oriented political media to infotainment, right? They try to entertain us. They try to sensationalize. They bring in people to argue and to generate outrage. So CNN is doing both of those things. Mainstream media outlets are doing both of those things. So there's been a fragmentation even within the mainstream media about the kind of presentation. So essentially, muckraking and yellow journalism, which were driven to the margins by the professionalization of the political media in the 1920s, came storming back. And we got people like Geraldo Rivera, who possibly, I think people probably still know who he is, but he was one of the early sensationalizers. There's a great movie that was made in 1976 called Network, which is about the the dying of the sort of mainstream media's public service ethic and the coming of this infotainment sensationalized news that was very prophetic and was actually sort of ahead of the curve on figuring out what was coming. So I would highly recommend Network 1975, maybe it's 1976. But we really know it. Like you now know. Like I hardly have to talk about this. When I first started teaching American politics in the early 90s, this was still a thing that was developing, and so I can talk about like, oh, this is a new thing. It's no longer a new thing. We're totally familiar with sensationalized, muckraking, yellow journalism style of mainstream media. It is somewhat infused with the traditional values because the primary creators of this sensationalized media are also at the same time these large-scale mainstream media outlets. They're adding entertainment and trying to titillate and sensationalize and outrage and enliven the audience within the context of continuing to do the same roles. And part of what CNN does with their sensationalized outrage type shows is they are actually also promoting the public forum. They're promoting that open debate, that second role of the media. They're bringing on, pro-Trump supporters and anti-Trump people to argue with each other. It's not particularly productive, I think, of a healthy political discourse because it is intended to sensationalize and outrage sensationalize political debate and outrage people. But it does draw viewers into the public forum, into that political debate. So it's playing that role, but because of the urge to sensationalize, the need, the imperative to actually draw audience and make profits through good ratings and advertising sales, it's playing that role with I would say, a diminished healthiness. The party press is also back in the sense that parties and interest groups and any political actor at all, right? Not just the big parties can do this, but every interest group, every organization that wants to have an impact, that wants to provide information to supporters or potential supporters to advance their goals. They have all kinds of outlets. They can use websites, email newsletters, YouTube channels, Facebook, Twitter. These organizations can make use of contemporary media channels that range from simple things like a web page to more sophisticated YouTube channels and Facebook advertising and all of that stuff. Again, you're probably familiar with this. Many of the most successful interest groups like the National Rifle Association or the ACLU, they have a very sophisticated social media operation. They have really good websites, they have their own videos that they produce, they have email lists they send out to their members, alerting them to what new content there is. They produce a ton of content for their supporters and fulfilling the role that the party press back in the 19th century fulfilled, which was providing information to people to generate and maintain their support. Now again, it is propaganda in the sense that what you're getting when you go to the NRA website or the ACLU website, and you watch one of their videos, you read one of their blog posts or one of their articles or read one of their white papers, you're getting information that they have vetted and culled and presented with the purpose of getting you to support a position or vote in a particular way or feel a certain way. Just like the party press in the 19th century was providing information to get people to want to support the Democratic or the Republican Party. So the purpose is no longer different. There's still this sort of preaching to the choir to keep the choir coming back and supportive and keep them as members and to let them know who they should vote for and what kinds of activities, political activities they should engage in, who to be outraged by. So the information, I'll put that in air quotes, the information that you get through this 21st century version of the party press is the same kind of propaganda. But as I said in the last lecture, propaganda is only truly dangerous when there's a monopoly on information dissemination, when there's one source of propaganda. Then it's directly manipulative. All of these party press outlets, and I use the term party now more broadly because it's not just the two main political parties, it's any interest group that wants to generate support, that wants to expand its support, that wants to make sure that its supporters stay informed and loyal, and that they do the things that the group wants them to do. So it's no longer just the party press, but much like the party press in the 19th century, where there was at least two forms of competing propaganda, there are now multiple forms of competing propaganda. One problem is that there's the real potential now, even more than ever, to find your echo chamber, your comfort zone, and linger in it. To go to the place, because it's so noisy and so competitive, and there are so many things demanding your attention, so many messages that are being shot right at you. You know, again, I think that you all know this even better than I know this, because you've grown up in this world where there's this just a relentless flow of information towards your face. There's the ability, with the party press aspect of 21st century media, to retreat into our comfort zones, to go into our bubbles, into our favorite echo chamber, to only read Breitbart, or to only read Huffington Post, or to only watch videos from organizations that are sending you messages that you already agree with, that comfort you. So there's definitely this preaching to the choir is what they're doing, it's what they intend to do, and then it gives people the opportunity to move into and stay in their echo chambers, and to then get more and more divided from people who have different forms of propaganda. So we choose, many of us choose our forms of propaganda, which is less damaging than when you have a singular outlet that monopolizes the production of propaganda, because then you can manipulate large populations. Here we have competing bubbles, essentially. There's all kinds of echo chambers that are wanting you to come inside that nice little comfort zone. So the competition keeps some level of honesty. But one of the skills that is needed in our 21st century media environment is the ability, the desire, to get outside of your comfort zone, to seek information that maybe pisses you off. My brother-in-law watches Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity, and I think that that actually kind of makes him a little crazy to see both of those things. But Rachel Maddow, I'll let you know, is his comfort zone, and Sean Hannity is way outside his echo chamber, and he wants to know what is happening in this other echo chamber. That takes a desire, and then to be able to continue doing that, it actually takes sort of the personal fortitude, and it also then takes intellectual skill to be able to listen to both of those sources and then figure out what you believe, instead of just like, well, I believe what Rachel Maddow says, and I listen to Sean Hannity just to see what crazy shit is being said from the other side. To listen to both of those sources and say, okay, the truth is somewhere between these two echo chambers. One of them really appeals to me, the other one really repels me, but the truth is not in either one of these things. So this is not an uncommon feature, as I talked about in previous lectures, of what is needed in a democratic society. Political media doesn't provide everything that our democratic society needs. It particularly does not provide the skills that we need to navigate what is now an increasingly fragmented, competitive, compelling media landscape. It doesn't teach us the skills that would allow us to tell fact from opinion, to be able to get outside of our comfort zone, to synthesize information from a variety of sources, to be able to judge the reliability of different sources. Those skills are as needed as ever, and even more essential because there's so much competition for our attention, that if we don't have those skills, then we can be lured into a place where we're actually getting propagandized very easily, and in fact by choice. Those skills, hopefully part of what you're getting in college, and what people are getting in high school, and what people are getting from their communities and their families, is the ability to navigate this environment. So the party press is actually, it is a great source of support for these parties and interest groups. And if people can use that as sources of information that can be triangulated from other sources of information, then it can actually be beneficial. But if it's echo chambery, and if you're just part of the choir that's being preached to, then it's not a particularly healthy thing. The partisan press is also back this kind of small-scale, artisanal, opinionating that was characterized by that first stage of the American political media, where your Ben Franklins had printing presses, and they used the printing presses to basically provide their opinion and their view on the world without any objectivity ethic, without any self-conscious role that I'm serving voters by giving them information that will help them to make up their own minds. No, I want to make up your mind for you. I have my mind made up, and I'm going to tell you, and I'm going to try to get you to make up your mind in my direction. That kind of expression of opinion with the hope to influence the political discourse that characterized the partisan press of the 17th or the 18th and early 19th century up until the Jacksonian era, where parties actually sort of muscled those small-scale operators out with their subsidized party newspapers. Those are back in all of the low-cost forms that are available. Blogs. All you need is you don't even need, it's free, right? You can blog on, there are so many free sites, Tumblr, WordPress, you can blog anywhere, Medium. Podcasts are relatively inexpensive to produce. I produce one myself, and it's not free, but it's relatively inexpensive to produce. It requires a lot of sweat equity, a lot of time if you can't pay other people to do the production for you, but you can get your viewpoint expressed through a podcast, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram to a certain extent, though Instagram is I would say the least political of all of the forms of social media. But basically, through the internet and the social media channels that are available, anybody can become an opinionator, can be part of this open public forum. And these channels have really added in a big way to the perspectives that were available to consumers of political media in the 20th century. The narrow perspective of college-educated white men who worked for mainstream establishment corporations and who had an establishment political viewpoint, their dominance of the media landscape has been broken by the return of the partisan press in these practically free methods. Now, they're free, but it doesn't guarantee you an audience. What the partisan press now requires, that wasn't required back in the 18th and early 19th century, was real hustle. If you owned a printing press in a small city in colonial America, basically you had a captive audience. People didn't have to read your pamphlets or your newspaper, but they weren't going to read anything else if they didn't read your stuff. Now, the people who make use of these channels of opinion expression they have to compete for audience. And the term platform is developed to indicate like people who actually have a platform, who have listeners or viewers or readers, whatever they happen to be, that people had to hustle to get platform. And so there's competition for it, but you can get it. And there are plenty of self-made opinionators out there, people who have huge followings on their podcast or on their Twitter feed or for their blog or their YouTube channel. There are people who can go from nothing and they can build a huge platform just out of scrappiness and hustle and actually having a product that people want to listen to or view or read or whatever it happens to be. So there's no longer just like, okay, I'm the dude in town who owns the printing press and so I have a monopoly. But so it's different in that sense, and obviously the channels are multiple. It's not just print, words, it's images, it's video, it's audio, it is multimedia writing. It's all of that stuff that's all of those abilities are made available to express your opinion. But largely the partisan press isn't doing a gathering of information, primary information, and finding things out. There are certainly people who are doing podcasts, who are doing actually their own investigative journalism, people who have YouTube channels who are producing original content that's actual information. But largely the partisan press is opinionating. They're taking other information or just their own ideas and they're turning it into opinions that they're expressing. So the partisan press is doing what it always did. It's contributing to the public debate in a way better way than in the original era, where there was basically just that one source, and those people were upper middle class white guys who owned printing presses. Now, anyone can do it. Now, that means it's a noisy world to enter into. It's noisy for the audience, it's noisy for the producers. There's a huge level of competition to get and maintain an audience that can always be taken away by someone else who's screaming for their eyes and ears. But it creates a very vibrant environment for political debate. So that role is being played, and many of the people who are involved in political versions of blogs and podcasts and YouTube channels are very self-consciously playing that second role of providing a public forum. They're not necessarily, some people are doing it, but they're not necessarily being multi-sided. But it doesn't matter. You don't have to present multiple perspectives in your podcast, because there are other podcasts out there that people can listen to that are presenting all kinds of perspectives. What you're trying to do is present your perspective and grab an audience and keep them listening to you because they like what it is that you're producing. So the current environment is one where we have a huge amount of diversity. There's a fragmentation of audience. There's all kinds of benefits in terms of multiple perspectives, all kinds of different sources of information, and there are pitfalls because of this competition and because of the need to grab an audience and because of the psychological propensities that many of us have to want to go to our comfort zone, to want to sit inside our echo chamber and be the choir and be preached at in that particular way, which soothes us in this noisy, fragmented, highly competitive world. All of this stuff will be discussed with greater sort of pointedness in the next lecture, which is about evaluating the current media environment. And I've gestured towards some of the things I'll say in that lecture, but for now I'm just going to say that's the political media of the 21st century, and it's something that you're very familiar with, and now you can see how it connects with the different stages of the political media history that I talked about in the last lecture.